You know that feeling when you finally get the job, the body, the relationship you said you wanted, and it still doesn't feel like you. Like you're wearing a costume that fits perfectly and still isn't yours. Most people call that burnout or ingratitude or just adulting. But there's a philosopher who looked at that exact feeling almost 150 years ago and said, "That's not a malfunction. That's the whole problem of being a self in the first place." That philosopher is Friedrich Nietzsche, a German thinker writing in the late 1800s, mostly alone, mostly sick, mostly ignored in his own lifetime. He wasn't trying to build a system you could follow like a recipe. He was diagnosing something. He looked at European culture and saw people who had inherited their values wholesale, from religion, from their parents, from what's done, without ever actually testing whether those values were theirs. And in a couple of key texts, The Gay Science and later Ecce Homo, he drops this phrase that's become a tattoo, a wallpaper quote, a caption under gym selfies: "Become who you are." It sounds like a riddle. How do you become something you already are? That contradiction is the whole point, and almost nobody sits with it long enough to understand what he actually meant. So let's actually sit with it. The phrase itself isn't originally Nietzsche's. He borrowed it from an old Greek poet, Pindar, who told people to become such as you are, having learned what that is. Nietzsche picks this up and turns it into something much stranger, because here's the thing. He's not saying you have some fixed, pre-written identity sitting inside you like a seed waiting to sprout. That's actually the opposite of what he believed. He didn't think there was a true self hiding underneath your habits and choices, waiting to be discovered like buried treasure. If anything, he thought that idea, the idea of a stable, essential you, was mostly an illusion people used to avoid the harder truth. The harder truth is this: you are not a thing, you are a process. Nietzsche talks about the self as something closer to a struggle between competing drives: ambition, fear, appetite, vanity, discipline, all pulling in different directions. None of them the real you more than the others. Most people never organize that chaos. They just get pushed around by whichever drive is loudest that day. You feel anxious, so you avoid the hard conversation. You feel insecure, so you overwork to prove something. You feel bored, so you scroll. None of that is a self. That's just weather. So when Nietzsche says, "Become who you are," he means something closer to take that raw material, those competing drives, that chaos, and give it form. Organize it. Discipline it into something coherent, something with a shape and a direction, something you could actually call a self with a straight face. He has this image he uses elsewhere of giving style to your character, treating your own personality the way an artist treats a block of marble. Not inventing something from nothing, but not just accepting the raw block either. Shaping it, cutting away what doesn't belong, deciding deliberately what stays. And here's where it gets uncomfortable, because Nietzsche is very clear that this process requires suffering, not suffering for its own sake. He wasn't into misery as a virtue, but he thought that becoming who you are necessarily means killing off parts of yourself that don't survive contact with honesty. The comfortable lies you tell yourself, the values you adopted because they were safe, not because you tested them, the identity you built to be liked rather than to be true. Nietzsche thought most people never even get to the starting line of self-creation because they're too busy protecting a self they never actually chose. There's also his famous idea of amor fati, the love of fate, which connects directly here. He didn't mean passively accepting whatever happens to you. He meant something more demanding, taking full ownership of your circumstances, your flaws, your failures, your limitations, and instead of resenting them or wishing you'd been dealt a different hand, using them as the actual material you build with. You don't become who you are by escaping your conditions. You become who you are by turning your conditions, even the painful ones, into something you authored rather than something that just happened to you. And underneath all of this is Nietzsche's deeper suspicion of what he called herd morality, the tendency to borrow your values from the crowd because it's easier and safer than working them out yourself. He thought most people's sense of right and wrong, of what a good life looks like, of what they should want, was basically inherited secondhand, never actually examined. And you cannot become who you are while running on secondhand values. You'll just become a well-behaved copy of everyone around you, which, to Nietzsche, is a kind of death disguised as normalcy. So put it together, and the phrase stops being a riddle and starts being a demand. You're not born a finished self. You're born a mess of raw drives and inherited opinions. Becoming who you are means examining that inheritance, discarding what isn't actually yours, and deliberately shaping what remains into something coherent. A self you built on purpose, not a self you just absorbed. Now here's where this stops being a 19th century philosophy lecture and starts being something you can actually use this week. Think about the guy who spent 5 years chasing a career path his father approved of. Good salary, respectable title, stable trajectory. And he's miserable. Not because the job is objectively bad, but because he never actually asked whether it was his ambition or a borrowed one. That's herd morality in a suit and tie. He's been optimizing for a self he never chose. Or think about the version of confidence a lot of guys perform online. The loud, unshakable, never wrong persona. A lot of that isn't self-possession. It's armor built to avoid the harder work Nietzsche is talking about. Actually confronting your competing drives, your fear, your contradictions, and doing the slow work of shaping them into something real. Performing certainty is easy. Earning it is the whole project. Or take something smaller. The relationship where you keep agreeing with your partner's opinions, adjusting your preferences to match theirs because conflict feels riskier than dishonesty. Nietzsche would say, you're not being kind there. You're avoiding the suffering required to actually have a self in that relationship. A self with edges, with its own tested values that can meet another person instead of dissolving into them. In every one of these cases, the work is the same. Stop asking, what am I supposed to want? And start asking, have I actually tested whether this is mine? That's uncomfortable. It should be. Nietzsche never promised this feels good in the moment. Here's where most people get this idea wrong, though, and it matters because the misreading is everywhere. Become who you are is not permission to do whatever you feel like and call it authenticity. That's actually the exact opposite of Nietzsche's point. Remember, he didn't trust raw impulse. He thought your unexamined drives were just as likely to be cowardice, vanity, or resentment as they were to be anything worth calling a true self. I'm just being myself is, ironically, the excuse of someone who's skipped the entire process Nietzsche is describing. Self-creation isn't indulgence, it's discipline. It's the artist cutting away the marble, not just admiring the block. The other common misreading treats this as a one-time event, like there's a finish line where you finally become who you are, and then you're done. Identity achieved, badge unlocked. Nietzsche didn't think that way. This was ongoing, unfinished, a process you stay inside of for your whole life. There's no arrival. There's only the continued work of testing, discarding, and reshaping. Anyone selling you a 5-step program to finally become who you are has missed the philosophy entirely. So, if there's one sentence to take from all of this, it's this: you don't discover who you are, you earn it through the discipline of choosing what stays and what goes. If this kind of thinking is useful to you, stick around. This channel is built entirely on ideas like this one. Consider subscribing, and I'll see you in the next one.